This is Stan J. Caterbone, Advanced Media Group, www.mgglobalentertainmentgroup.com. This is a documentary on the psychiatric industry that I recorded yesterday, April 20th, 2018. It's now 9:25 a.m., Saturday, April 21st, 2018.
Treatment when it comes to clinical medicine as practiced by real doctors. Psychiatrists, of course, believe that people can be treated against their will.
In 1956, psychiatrist Winfred Overholser presented a plan to Congress intended to take involuntary commitment to a whole new level. The plan: purchase 1 million acres of Alaskan wilderness, build a huge mental asylum, and change the commitment laws so that anyone could be shipped off with no more than a simple nod from a psychiatrist. The bill sailed through the House of Representatives, but when the public caught wind of the plan, they became enraged, referring to it as Siberia, USA. The bill was quickly struck in the Senate. But while the death of the Siberia bill put a stop to their large-scale plans, involuntary commitment still remained the most effective and profitable method for filling psychiatric institutions.
Again, the person has committed no crime and has no trial and is sent directly to a mental hospital, which is really a prison.
How many people go to an insane asylum and say, please lock me up? Doctors don't lock up anybody. Psychiatrists lock you up.
Even children can be taken from their parents with little legal recourse.
They just invaded our home. They came in with officers. Our kids are scared. You know, they come in with a piece of paper and say, you're giving us your kids. And it's like, you know, how can they just come in and do that?
She said you could be arrested for medical neglect. And I said, but how is that when, you know, this is my child? And I see that he doesn't need that much medication. Why would you threaten me with something like that?
At 10 p.m., 2 policemen and 2 social workers came to my house and took all 4 of my kids away.
Once committed to psychiatric hospitals, patients are drugged and restrained.
The more a person objects, the more this objection is construed as symptom of a mental illness.
At which point the person would be locked up in restraints. There would be the ankle, the knee, the waist, the head, the wrist, and the shoulder restraints. And if there was almost any resistance at all, the person then would be medicated to a point where they would almost be knocked out.
We had one case where they actually took a patient in a seclusion room and beat him up. Then they lied about it to the services that investigated. So it's a pretty wide range of abuse issues that we've encountered.
Psychiatric staff provoke their patients into violence so they can bill insurance companies up to $400 a day for each restrained patient.
A patient would resist diagnosis, resist treatment, or also want to leave treatment. And that person's situation would be exacerbated until they were put into constraints and medicated, at which point there would be documented reasons to keep that person in treatment.
The burden of such claims is passed directly to the public in the form of soaring healthcare premiums. As for their victims, the experience is traumatic and even lethal.
16-year-old Rochelle Claiborne died in Laurel Ridge's care last August. The state report shows during the restraint, quote, Rochelle stated several times she could not breathe.
In almost all respects, the staff behaved appropriately, followed the standards.
By taking advantage of weak or vague restraint laws, psychiatrists and their staff are almost never held criminally liable for assault, battery, and murder.
He begged me to take him home, take him out of there, that they were treating him wrongly, and he didn't want to stay there. And I got a call that there had been an accident, that they held him down until he couldn't breathe anymore. I wish I would have listened to him, take him out of there before it had happened. And then I miss him every day. And I wish I could have him back, but I can't.
To this day, no one has been charged for the child's murder. The elderly are a prime target for psychiatric abuse. with treatment of senior citizens in mental institutions in the U.S. costing private and government insurance nearly $4.5 billion a year.
Unwarranted commitment has occurred that wouldn't have occurred if the people hadn't had insurance. The proof of that pudding is generally in how fast they get out once the insurance runs out.
Involuntary commitment is a form of psychiatric slavery, where persons are treated as if they're property and they are deprived of liberty, and people are making money in the process.
As long as you have involuntary malhospitality, psychiatry is a prison work. It's a crime against humanity, is it not medicine?
Every 40 seconds, someone is involuntarily committed to a psychiatric institution. And if you think this is something that can't happen to you, or someone you know, think again. In the time it took you to watch this chapter, 10 people have been institutionalized against their will. And with hundreds of billions of dollars allocated to hospitals internationally since 1975, psychiatrists have carved out for themselves a lucrative
Much time and thought into their marriages as they did their wedding.
hidden behind a dubious interpretation of the law. But far too often, psychiatrists commit crimes too blatant to be ignored.
The FBI has raided the headquarters of one of the nation's largest operators of psychiatric hospitals.
Hundreds complained of overbilling, misdiagnosed conditions, and insurance fraud. Investigators say they found more than 5,000 similar cases in all 50 states.
Psychiatrists clearly are getting rich.
Psychiatrists traded drugs for sex, filed false insurance claims, and exploited patients sexually.
We have uncovered some of the most elaborate, aggressive, creative, deceptive, immoral, and illegal schemes being used to fill empty hospital beds with insured and paying patients.
Every psychiatrist takes an oath to follow an ethical code of conduct, to put the care of their patients above all else. But of all medical disciplines, psychiatry has the worst record of fraud and abuse.
Psychiatry is almost a license to print money. If a doctor were clever enough, and many of them are, there's no reason that they couldn't make at least $500,000 a year fraudulently and get away with it in psychiatry.
I don't purport to have deposed every psychiatrist in Las Vegas. I can tell you for a fact I haven't. Maybe I've deposed half, and by and large, they were a dishonest, deceitful, lying bunch of people.
So prevalent are their deceptive and criminal billing practices. Insurance investigators have slang for it, like the California wave and the $100 handshake.
$100 handshake is when usually a patient is institutionalized. Psychiatrists, psychologists will visit that person, shake hands with them, say, hello, I'm Dr. So-and-so, I'm taking care of your problem here, and then leaves.
They might have 10 or 20 patients there. They bill an hour for each one, and they might be in the hospital for a total of 30 minutes. So 20 patients, 20 hours, and they'd send the bills off to Medicaid.
We see that most of the victims of recovered memory therapy were women who had excellent health insurance, whether it was government insurance or private insurance, because many insurance policies wouldn't pay for this kind of long-term nonsense. So those people were targeted because of the nature of the insurance that they had.
Every year, the U.S. psychiatric industry defrauds government and private insurance of $5 billion, using any means possible to deceive the public.
There were some advertisements, very seductive advertisements, for people wanting to lose weight and were having problems losing weight. And they would be given, all expenses paid to go to a particular spa. But when they got to this spa and went in and signed in, it wasn't a spa, it was a psychiatric center. And then they couldn't get out.
What instead they received massive doses of mind-altering drugs, and they were kept for a lengthy period of time, and their insurance carrier was billed tremendous amounts of money for something that was unnecessary.
But their lies go beyond the psych ward and into the courts, where as paid witnesses, they will say anything to collect their fee.
a psychiatric expert who will have one opinion in one scenario and a completely opposite opinion in another scenario based on which law firm or governmental agency is paying for his time.
The psychiatrist, on one hand, will tell the public that suicide can be prevented, but will go into court and tell a jury that suicide cannot be prevented. And then once you show his prior inconsistent statements, you also show that he is paid very well by pharmaceuticals, then the jury says, you know what, we're not so sure about you because you just lied to us.
Add to the greed, dishonesty, and deceitfulness their sex crimes. Studies have shown that at least 10% of psychiatrists committed sex-related offenses against their patients.
It has happened so often that by the mid-'80s, the insurance companies who insure physicians across America started writing sexual claims out of the policies altogether. That's how common it was.
The system is so broken that more than 25,000 complaints have been registered, but nothing acted upon. When a psychiatrist has a patient, a female patient, and abuses them sexually, there's a very high probability they'll get away with it.
I've seen many cases where the mental health professional becomes very disturbed and is using very strange and odd treatments, and that can go on for many years with no one finding out about it because it's not very public. It's quite private. Things happen behind closed doors.
Tragically, their sex crimes often involve children. Case in point, Dr. C. Markham Berry. On the surface, a well-respected member of his community. But all that shattered when he was arrested on child molestation charges. Van loads of child pornography were removed from his home, and the subsequent investigation uncovered his sexual abuse of former patients. Boys aged 7 to 17, who he photographed and sodomized. All part of what the state called 50 years of Berry's rampant, undetected sexual escapades with children. This is not an isolated incident. It is the carefully masked character of many members of this profession. In every country throughout the world, you could well find psychiatrists committing rape, sexual abuse, murder, and fraud. And as you will see, psychiatry's entire credibility depends on the biggest fraud of all.
I was diagnosed with a chemical imbalance, manic depression.
They diagnosed me with having ADD.
He told me I had conduct disorder,
ADHD,
mild depression,
major depression,
manic depressive,
Borderline personality disorder,
social anxiety,
depression, schizophrenia, depression,
sleep disorder, identity problem disorder.
all of these so-called diseases are just made up. They're just fabricated. They're fictions of psychiatry imagination.
What would psychiatrists do without their labels? They couldn't pretend to be real doctors anymore, you know? Neither could psychologists, you know? Diagnosing, what a godlike thing to do. Making diagnoses, and here's your treatment, a pill.
Because so far they're not proving that any so-called mental illnesses exist. These are labels, and that's all they are.
But without proof, you can't have credibility. So psychiatrists manufacture their own.
It's based on a grab bag of checklists for disorders that are published in a book called the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. There are no statistics in this book, by the way. That just makes it sound more scientific.
They create this cluster of disease, and they get together and they vote. Is this a disease? All in favor, say aye.
The American Psychiatric Association is the publisher and owner and wealthy owner of DSM. They've made a great deal of money on DSM.
Since the first edition of the DSM, the number of mental disorders voted into psychiatry's diagnostic manual has grown to 374. And with each new disorder, psychiatrists create yet another way to defraud the public.
If you have 27 ways to bill in DSM, that's 27 ways to bill. If you have 300, that's 300 ways to bill. So you can pretty much find anyone walking on the street that can fit into a DSM somehow.
When you build insurance companies, you can't say the word. You've got to send a number. And they have numbers for the most ridiculous things. You know, like arguing with your mother or peeing in the bed.
Adolescent rebellion disorder is an official psychiatric diagnosis. Arithmetic learning disorder is an official psychiatric diagnosis. General anxiety disorder is a recent diagnosis.
The psychiatric industry takes advantage of that. They say, wow, we can get these things categorized, make it look scientific, so let's label everything. Now we have a label for it. We put a coding. If you've ever seen a medical insurance form, everything has a code.
In DSM, it just looks like sort of some magical numbers. Of course, what we're talking about is reimbursement for mental health treatment as an illness.
The more types of codings, the more types of illnesses you can come up with, the more claims can be paid, and the more reasons for treatment, and the more reasons for revenue for the psychiatric establishment, for the hospitals, and of course the pharmaceutical companies.
Incredibly enough, while presenting the DSM to the world as scientific fact, psychiatrists freely admit its utter lack of science.
We have no diagnostic reliable markers for almost any illness there is in the DSM.
What we're testing for in psychiatry, it's hard to say because there's nothing specifically.
But as far as a test that's clinically useful, basically we're not there yet.
We don't have any laboratory tests that we can use to determine whether somebody does or doesn't have a mental illness.
There are no good biological tests for detecting mental illness.
There is no test, there's no biopsy you can do.
There is no chemical test right now.
There are no specific tests to confirm the diagnosis or show the improvement, like any blood tests or any x-rays or anything like that.
Oh, in my practice I don't do any tests. I just speak with people and listen to them, and then I make a decision in what kind of illness.
These diagnoses vary as widely as the psychiatrists who make them. In this hidden camera footage, a person visited several different psychiatrists, complaining of the same symptoms.
I'm extremely unorganized, and I didn't used to be. It's caused problems in the family. It's caused problems getting, I'm self-employed.
You've got ADD, ADHD, and you're depressed. And your depression is bipolar depressed.
You have a brain chemistry disorder, and it's probably genetic.
You have a lot of the symptoms of depression.
So it seems like it is a mixed picture. What it means is like we've got some depressive symptoms and some, high symptoms.
If you're bipolar, I'll need to give you a mood stabilizer. We don't know. I kind of doubt it.
It's considered low-grade bipolar.
You're more with ADD than ADHD.
And as far as medications for depression, because I would recommend that you start a medication, which are Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Celexa.
Usually Focalin XR is pretty good.
I'll give you some Lexapro in the morning and some Trazodone at night.
Lamictal is a better medication for that. It works in your depression also.
But the treatment for any bipolar cycling is the same. Lithium.
Remeron is another one.
Trazodone.
Tegranol.
Depakote.
Wellbutrin.
Lexapro.
Lamictal.
Equitrol.
Depakote.
Ritalin.
Lithium.
Ambien.
You may need an antidepressant also with your Lamictal.
We don't know if I give you a medication if it is going to work or not.
To a certain degree, it's trial and error.
You never know if it's the right drug.
How many people have I cured? Well, there are no real cures right now in psychiatry.
I have cured none of my patients.
We're always challenged by our lack of knowledge.
In fact, we don't know what the causes of mental illness are.
Most mental illnesses, we do not know the cause.
Of course, it would be nice to know exact reasons of disorders, but maybe in the future.
I'm the Director of Research at the American Psychiatric Association. We don't know the etiology of really any of the mental disorders at the present time.
DSM-5 is grown to 10 times its original size, and it labels everybody. I could find 5 diagnoses that would fit you or anybody else in there.
Compare this to the research methods of pathology, a real science that discovers real diseases using a wide variety of precise diagnostic tests.
We do millions of laboratory tests as well as the structural examination and the microscopic examination. It's a whole series of applied scientific procedures. In the case of psychiatry, there isn't any laboratory tool that can precisely identify psychiatric disease and allow it to be classified.
It's not as if there's some study of tissue or some study of the body or some study of matter. These are all categories which are made up. They're simply made up. They don't exist in nature. They're decided upon by psychiatrists and voted on.
Psychiatrists are not the only ones who benefit from the DSM. Wherever you find a psychiatric diagnosis, you'll find a psychiatric drug.
The pharmaceutical corporations now contribute enormous sums of money for the education of psychiatric residents and for the support of research by their professors, so that psychiatry today has become in America, has become very largely learning which drug to use with which disease or disorder.
This to me is completely unethical, untenable, unacceptable for this to occur. The web of money is all over the place. It has compromised psychiatry, and now it's compromising psychology. And worst of all, it's compromising the patients.
In 2006, a study revealed that 56% of all psychiatrists deciding what disorders to list in their diagnostic manual had financial ties to drug companies. Today, we see the consequences, a barrage of drugs, each one targeted at an invented disorder that is backed by an arbitrary diagnosis found in the DSM.
The fact that it is couched in the language of science, without necessarily having any of the scientific data or underpinnings to justify it, is as threatening as anything we've seen today.
And psychiatry's latest and most expensive ploy to fool the public by imitating legitimate medicine, brain scans.
We can scan all the brains we want to. The fact that we see changes in different people's brains, changes in functioning, doesn't mean that we've discovered anything that has its origin in the brain. It just means that we're seeing changes, but it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the brain.
They have no reliable measures about precise blood flow patterns for any of the psychiatric disorders using any of the scans.
It's marketing. This is marketing. This is not science. This is incredibly effective marketing. It has nothing to do with science.
Psychiatrists and psychologists use the DSM to label 450 million people worldwide as mentally ill. A total equal to the populations of France, Italy, Germany, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Russia combined. While sales of the psychiatric drugs they push have topped $84 billion annually, funding from world governments for these patients grows psychiatry over $250 billion a year. And much of this money comes from the diagnosis and drugging of our most trusting and vulnerable.
That's what Mary Osmond has. yeah, they had my case. Had it since 91. They declared that I was suffered psychiatric abuses.
We have swallowed all manner of poisonous certainties fed us by our parents and school teachers. If the race is to be freed from its crippling burden of good and evil, it must be psychiatrists who take the original responsibility.
Brock Chisholm's declaration typified the psychiatric onslaught aimed directly at our school system.
They actually said the purpose.
Taking drugs. Children don't ask to be diagnosed. They don't want to be called crazy. So you ask the classic Roman question, legal question, cui bono, who benefits? The people who makes the diagnosis.
Psychiatry should actually go into government, that politicians should listen to psychiatrists. Psychiatrists should be in every parliament and should direct and monitor political activities.
Psychiatry, in little more than a century, has adversely impacted society on a global scale, and not by accident.
People aren't aware that in 1940, a prominent British psychiatrist, Colonel J.R. Rees, addressed the National Council on Mental Hygiene and set the agenda for psychiatry for the next 60 years. Since then, psychiatrists have been given authority in nearly every sector of our society, with tragic results.
We are saying to make it permeate every educational activity in our national life. Public life, politics, and industry should all of them be within our sphere of influence. We have made a useful attack upon a number of professions. The two easiest of them, naturally, are the teaching profession and the church. The most difficult are law and medicine.
Rees's colleague, psychiatrist G. Brock Chisholm, co-founder of the World Federation for Mental Health, later expanded upon psychiatry's plans.
To achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, loyalty to family traditions, national patriotism, and religious dogmas.
To implement their plan, American psychiatrists convinced the U.S. Congress that mental illness was a national threat that only they, with vast increases in funding, could solve, and thus began massive U.S. government expenditures for psychiatric research, which have climbed from $1 million a year in 1946 to $1.5 billion today, an increase of more than 150,000%. As psychiatric influence spread across America, it also spread throughout the world. Behind crisis after world crisis, you'll often find the handiwork of psychiatry. Example, Serbian psychiatrist Jovan Raskovic, who demanded the ethnic cleansing of Croats and Muslims because of his firm belief in their racial inferiority. The result, Bosnia in the 1990s, where Raskovic's colleague, psychiatrist Radovan Karadzic, and Prime Minister Slobodan Milosevic established Balkan concentration camps, where the mass torture, rape, and murder of the innocent happened once more. One military psychiatrist explained how it was done.
C'est très difficile tuer millions de personnes. C'est très difficile, techniquement difficile. Les Allemands étaient bons techniciens et ils ne pouvaient pas, ils pouvaient seulement 6 millions de Juifs exterminés. Ils massacrent, par exemple, 100 ou 200 de personnes, ou violent 100 femmes et 100 jeunes filles, pour que les autres sont effrayés et échappent. Alors vous avez le terrain pur.
With century-old Pavlovian conditioning, coupled with modern-day mind manipulation techniques and drugs, psychiatrists and psychologists can turn average men, and even children, into mass murderers.
You could train them to use firearms indiscriminately. You could train them to shoot people with very little feeling or thought. You could train them to use abusive and brutalizing procedures in order to obtain information with no hesitancy, with no concern.
Key terrorist acts have been influenced in this way. In the wake of 9/11, Osama bin Laden was characterized as the mastermind behind the attacks. But an acknowledged brain trust and commander of Al-Qaeda is Ayman al-Zawahiri, educated in psychology and pharmacology at the University of Cairo, and the author of the Al-Qaeda training manual on the use of coercive psychiatry. And orchestrating the terrorist bombings in Madrid, Abu Hafiza, another Al-Qaeda operative, relying on those same techniques to manipulate the minds of men.
You can implant memories. Memories are potent sources of motivated behavior. If you implant enough memories of specific kinds, you can shape and change the nature of human thinking and feelings.
And it was thought to be a kind of ultimate weapon, because what greater weapon could there be than control of the human mind?
You can control minds, and you can move people around, particularly when you control their lives. It's easier to control their minds.
When we look at psychiatry and psychology, social control is the primary agenda.
And that agenda manifests in another way throughout the world right now, with mental health screening campaigns fed to the public under such innocuous-sounding names as Teen Screen.
The national government is actually encouraging it and wanting to test every single kid in our public school system.
All children are put under this kind of a test for psychiatric evaluation. A 10-minute test that tells them absolutely nothing.
I predict that upwards of 90% of all the people screened will be diagnosed as having a psychiatric disorder, which means that we'll have an entire generation that will be a perfect profit center.
The man behind the Teen Screen program, psychiatrist David Schaffer, consultant to the U.S. Department of Defense.
They're not just screening children to have complete control of the 52 million children in school. They're screening now, and they will screen their parents, and they will screen all adults in America.
The idea of mass screening for mental illness in the American population, run by a government initiative, is one of the scariest ideas I ever heard of.
Psychiatry is politics. Has always been politics. It is politics pure and simple, because politics, psychiatry was always the application of force against people who don't want to be forced.
It's a sad thing, and parents better wake up. Society better wake up, because we're in serious trouble if they don't.
In the 1940s, psychiatrists announced their intention to infiltrate all sectors of society. This is now a reality. We don't have an epidemic of mental illness. We have an epidemic of psychiatry. And it's harming and killing in the name of mental health. Something can and must be done about it. Founded in 1969 by the Church of Scientology, the Citizens Commission on Human Rights investigates and exposes psychiatric violations of human rights. Its international headquarters in Los Angeles, California, serves as a public information clearinghouse, documenting psychiatry's invasive and harmful practices and publishing its findings in 17 languages. Cchr has distributed more than 12 million copies to healthcare professionals, government officials, educators, and business leaders around the world. While the documentaries and public service announcements it's produced have appeared on television and across the internet, informing nearly 200 million people with the facts about psychiatry and psychotropic drugs. Cchr CCHR International also operates a hotline to provide free assistance to individuals who find themselves caught up in the mental health system. What is today a global human rights movement began more than 30 years ago with a fight for the freedom of one individual, Victor Giori, forcibly committed to a Pennsylvania psychiatric hospital. The hospital psychiatrist claimed Giori was babbling incoherently and diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic. But Giori wasn't insane. He was speaking Hungarian. CCHR filed a lawsuit against the hospital and its abusive psychiatric treatment. Their defense of Giori was so tenacious that in the middle of the case, the psychiatrist running the hospital stood up and announced, "We want nothing more to do with Victor Giori." Securing Victor Giori's release was the first of thousands of cases championed by CCHR.
CCHR challenged involuntary commitment laws throughout the United States and internationally. What we found was that people were being incarcerated without any legal rights.
They had no right to an attorney. They could be drugged, shot, lobotomized without their consent.
In apartheid South Africa, CCHR exposed secret psychiatric work camps where tens of thousands of Africans were incarcerated, drugged, subjected to electric shock, and then farmed out as slave labor. When apartheid ended, CCHR presented testimony to South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, resulting in a government inquiry into psychiatric racism. In Australia, CCHR exposed a psychiatric practice called deep sleep treatment. Patients were given a cocktail of barbiturates and psychiatric drugs.
They were subjected to electroshock treatment daily, sometimes twice daily, without their knowledge. Deep sleep treatment caused 48 deaths.
CCHR investigated it, exposed it, and fought until deep sleep treatment was banned and its victims compensated. In Italy, CCHR, working with legislators and the media, conducted raids on psychiatric hospitals, the conditions of which were barbaric. CCHR persisted until those institutions were closed. In Japan, CCHR exposed patient abuse and the financial crimes of psychiatrists and hospitals, defrauding the government and taxpayers of millions. The guilty were convicted of fraud, and patient protections were implemented. And in the United States, CCHR uncovered a billion-dollar fraud in the nation's largest chain of private mental health facilities. 600 federal agents conducted raids across 20 states. Dozens of prosecutions ensued, millions of dollars in fines imposed, and the entire chain of corrupt hospitals was permanently closed. And the list goes on. In Australia, France, Germany, Hungary, and the United Kingdom, CCHR has not only been responsible for closing thousands of abusive psychiatric facilities, but at the same time, they have restored patient rights all over the world. And it was CCHR that sounded the alarm about the dangers of psychiatric drugs, resulting in public warnings about their use. Such as in Europe, where its medicines agency slapped antidepressants with suicide warning labels. South Africa, where the government now warns elderly citizens about the risks associated with taking antipsychotics. And the United States and Mexico, where thanks to CCHR's efforts in promoting the Child Medication Safety Act, parents can no longer be forced to give their children psychotropic drugs.
CCHR has documented the side effects of these psychiatric drugs. It's taken evidence to the FDA, it's gone to Congress, and it's obtained congressional hearings.
CCHR was the first organization to expose that antidepressants could cause suicide and violence in patients. And due to CCHR's efforts, the FDA held hearings in 1991, but it would take the FDA a further 13 years before they finally issued black box warnings that antidepressants could cause suicide in patients.
All told, CCHR is responsible for nearly 200 laws and 300 official drug warnings, safeguarding the public from the dangers of the psychiatric pharmaceutical industry.
CCHR is causing things to change by being champions for a growing number of well-intentioned people who are risking their professional careers to speak up against the abuses of psychiatry.
Having the ability to call upon an organization like CCHR and to take your side and help fight back against, seemingly the insurmountable odds, it's a tremendous blessing.
They speak up, speak out, and speak for those who can't speak for themselves, and then they go and help those who can't help themselves. So CCHR is known as a group that is actually doing something. They're not just talk. They are full of action.
And they make change. They have changed laws. They have made it where we have to put labels. Oh gosh, does this medication, cause suicidal thoughts or tendencies? Label it.
They're not sitting there going, we think psychiatrists are being abusive, but they're going out and doing something about it. They're taking down cases, they're following these things up, they're collecting evidence, and they're presenting this to lawmakers and law enforcement so that these abuses don't happen.
CCHR is the only body, by the way, that I've ever seen that actually has the backing to be able to stand up and do something, now anywhere in the world.
Wherever and whenever psychiatrists abuse human rights, CCHR takes its message to the streets. From the United States to Japan, and from Canada to the United Kingdom, members of CCHR lead marches to secure the protection and freedom from psychiatric abuse for everyone.
You've got 1 million people being electroshocked every year. You have someone being involuntarily committed every 40 seconds. And you have 20 million children taking mind-altering drugs. And it's all under the guise of mental health.
The only way you're going to get humane treatment in the mental health system is to take psychiatry and its vested interests out of the picture. And only then will people be able to truly obtain mental health.
You have two choices. Either you pretend you knew nothing about it, or you do something about it. With knowledge comes responsibility. That's why we're here. That's why people are joining forces with CCHR.
Today, CCHR has over 150 chapters in 30 countries, with thousands of members joined together to defend human rights against psychiatric abuse. It is a fight that will continue until psychiatry's abusive and coercive practices cease, and human rights and dignity are returned to all.
This is Stan J. Caterbone, Advanced Media Group, www.amg globalentertainmentgroup.com. It's now 10:10 a.m. Saturday, April 21st, 2018. I was scanning for something to watch yesterday and saw this, so I recorded it.